All right, so today we are here with Adam Tavel. Adam was class of 2003.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. I remembered. And so Adam, tell us about your time at LVC and like what did you major in? What kind of a student were you?
Well, hello, everyone. Yeah, I love talking about my time at LDC. It was life-changing in many ways. So I came to Lebanon Valley because I was attracted by the historical communications major, which I had never heard of. Most people had never heard of. But I came from a blue-collar family, and somewhere around my sophomore year, my mom just said, "You're going to college," which was news to me. And I was a solid B student, and I was a sharp guy in many ways, but college was profoundly intimidating to me because I just didn't understand all the ins and outs of it. And long story short, my mom took me to a college fair, and there was an LVC rep. I grew up outside of Annapolis in Maryland, and lo and behold, the person from LVC was the friendliest and warmest person there. It was a young woman, so I felt like she was closer in age to me than some of the other college reps. And she asked me what I was interested in. I said English and history, and she said, "We have a program for you." And so she gave me, sort of an overview of the HISCOM program, and a year or two later, however long, I was at LVC. And so, it was, I look back and I wince because I only applied to one institution. I only applied to LVC. I had an eye on that program, and thank goodness scholarships and financial aid helped me through that journey. But, in many ways, coming to LVC, not only did I meet my beautiful, lovely wife there, we were both history majors together, some of my best friends I met, but it was really my introduction to, a bigger world in all senses of that phrase, a bigger world in terms of academic rigor, but also it broadened my understanding of who I am and my place in the world, and the human story and the human cost of things. And I think that those gifts of critical thinking have really carried with me.
Cool. So when you finished LVC, when you got through, tell us about your what you did afterwards. You got into you went to University of Toledo, is that right? Or
Yeah, and so I had a funky senior year. I finished at LVC in 3 years, which was for financial reasons, and basically I was having trouble getting funds for a fourth year, and so I just sort of overloaded and finished my degree in three. But I did study abroad fall semester of my senior year, which I don't advise. It was an amazing experience, but I came back to something of a early life crisis because I didn't know what I was going to do after I graduated, and then I had a very rigorous final spring semester, also overloaded in terms of course. I knew I wanted to go to graduate school for a couple of reasons. I wanted to continue learning. I wanted to hide from adult responsibilities for a little while longer. And I applied to a whole bunch of different programs. And the one I chose was the University of Toledo because they offered me a fellowship. So not only would my master's be tuition free, but that I'd actually get a modest stipend to be a teaching assistant. And the great advice that you gave me and Dr. Pettis and several other folks was, if you can avoid it, don't pay for graduate school, which is a really, really great piece of advice. And to investigate the cost of programs and to ask yourself, what are my priorities? Where am I at with my family and personal life? And what makes the most amount of sense? And so I went to the University of Toledo. I spent 2 years there and got a master's degree in English literature, of all things. And in many ways, my life and my journey has been this sort of insistence that language and literature and history are these two streams that come together and inform each other and deepen each other. So, yeah.
so the advantage of that in terms of getting where you are now is that you were a TA and you got teaching experience, which is, really awesome. I mean, that is the good part about going to graduate school is because because of the school's desire for cheap labor, they shove people who basically are smart but don't know what the hell they're doing in front of a classroom full of undergraduates who are paying for paying for, well, sorry, I shouldn't say, but they're just, it's a kind of brutal system in a lot of ways. So but it gave you that teaching experience.
Yeah, and I have a lot of good things to say about the University of Toledo. It was a good time in my life, but it was a sharp learning curve because I had not, coming from LBC, which is small liberal arts, it's easy to know your professors, for them to know you. I felt like I had found some incredible mentors, present company included. Going to a major state university, where faculty were pleasant, but they weren't particularly interested in chatting in the hallway, let alone, just getting to know who I was. And then, having no teaching experience, I had worked in the writing center at LBC, which was an incredible thing to do. If anybody's watching this and they haven't thought about tutoring, whether privately or through the writing center or some other agency, it's such an incredible thing. It's one thing to think you know something. It's another thing trying to explain it to someone. But yeah, I got my feet wet with some teaching experience. I got to learn how a major university where tens of thousands of people go, how to try not to feel like a cog in that system. And negotiating, if we're going to be very candid here, negotiating the fact that that school was not my top choice. I had other institutions that I was able to get into, but the notion that I could leave with a master's, having not spent a single penny on tuition, and saying to myself, what makes more sense, going to a more prestigious or elite place, but coming out with gobs of debt, or going to a respected state school and sort of through a fellowship program. And so I went that route instead, and I haven't ever regretted it. And, it's delicate being in your early 20s, trying to say to yourself, okay, so I have this bachelor's degree. How do I find my way in the world? And I think a lot of us spent a couple of years trying to negotiate all that. And, I was painting houses while I was in graduate school. I painted my way. That's how I paid my rent in Toledo. I painted houses and I did odd jobs on weekends, and I tutored whenever I could pick up hours in their tutoring center, which was far larger than the one at LVC. But, I was very aware of the fact that, like, it's kind of a hand to mouth, existence. But I knew that if I persevered, it made more sense in the long run than taking on $50 or $100 or $150,000 for a master's degree.
Yeah, I remember having those conversations with you before you went, and because it's very, very hard to, it probably helped that you basically paid for your own undergraduate schooling, so you were pretty aware of all those kind of trade-offs. So.
Yeah, and it's the thing that I would recommend, not that I'm trying to pepper our conversation with lots of pearls of wisdom, but
sure.
Looking back on myself, and part of this is just because of the family situation I come from, but I wish that, like freshman year of high school, like, I had just had more conversations just like what college is. Well, what does it mean? Why is it important to maybe consider going? It's something that hit me towards the end of my sophomore year of high school. And then I freaked out a little bit because it felt so foreign and strange. And so too, coming back from England as a study abroad student, a senior in college, having already shaved a year off, I hadn't really done enough legwork or just like thought experiments about, okay, so I'm going to graduate at some point. What the heck do I do next? And I think just having thought about it earlier, and maybe just Googled some stuff would have done me well. I mean, it worked out, but, I think the earlier you start thinking about those sort of big unknowns, just to get comfortable with your discomfort is actually like a really healthy thing to do. And then asking yourself, okay, hypothetically, I go get a master's degree. Hypothetically, I apply to a bunch of grad schools and none of them accept me. Hypothetically, I get in somewhere, but they don't offer me a very nice financial package. And so I have to take out a lot of loans, just sort of like walking through that sort of thing. And I developed those skills eventually, thanks to my course of study at LVC. I got those critical thinking and self-inventory skills, I think. But I think a lot of us come to college and don't have them.
I didn't have them, and both my parents went to college, and I did the same thing you did. I applied and got a Fulbright to Sri Lanka, and that's only because an anthropology professor, who I wasn't really, honestly, even all that close to, but he was just an exceptionally nice guy, Jack Weatherford, and Jack Weatherford basically took a rough idea of an idea of looking at the Max Weber's Spirit of Protestantism and looking at it in the Sri Lanka, which of course stupidly, I just completely abandoned that once I got there. But that got me a year where then I, applied to graduate schools. But yeah, the whole way through, I had no real clear idea what I was doing except a desire. I mean, a lot of it was, so I relate to why a lot of students want to go to graduate school. It's because, I didn't really like high school. I really loved college. And I thought, oh, then I get to stay in college. That sounds great. And then you do, and then you realize, yeah. So I would say rewatch Animal House and watch the professor of the Donald Sutherland lecture to the class where he's trying to get them to read Milton. And they're all ignoring it, and he finally just says, "Come on, this is my job." So, please, just pretend. Anyway. So.
No, I'm with you. I spent the last 2 years of high school thinking, get me out of here. And it's not because I had a particularly, negative high school experience, but I just felt understimulated intellectually. I felt fatigued with just the social aspects of high school, who's cool, who's not, and even at 14, 15 going like, there's got to be more to life than, the cattiness of just all this nonsense and the cliquishness. And, I within a few weeks at college, I just felt more comfortable, just with who I was and with, the new friends I was making. And I felt like, this is kind of my place. I felt much more at ease. And it's ironic that I had to go, a couple of 100 miles from Maryland to Pennsylvania to feel that sort of comfort. But, I love my time at LVC and the truth of the matter is, there was some part of me that wanted to kind of just duck out and hide a little bit in graduate school. Hiding with purpose, of course. I knew I was headed somewhere. But I also, now that I teach myself, I think that motivation just to hide or just to stay in school, that alone can be dangerous if not coupled with some other thing.
Right. No,
some sense of a career path or some sense of, where the economy is and stuff like that.
Right. I mean, unless your parents are like rich, like Downton Abbey rich, then yes, go do a PhD at Oxford and study whatever you want. And 15 years later, we'll talk again, and then when you're the Earl of Cheshamshire, you can write, 3 or 4 books on local history in the Middle Ages. It'll be fabulous, but you never have to actually make a living. And so most people can't afford that.
Yeah. And one of the things that enrages me is the way that we've decided, and I want to be careful how I say this here. I'm grateful that we are finally having some really important conversations as a culture and as a society about tolerance and inclusivity and, justice in the face of injustice. Curiously, ageism is one area where we seem to not only not be making any progress, but we've regressed. And so the way we talk about senior citizens in our society, for example, I find to be pretty, gross. But we've done it to young people as well. We act like people in their teens and 20s are millennials. They're not. They're Gen Z or whatever, but they're not millennials. And not only that, this idea that at 19 or 20 people are bumbling and clueless, I think is just a pretty gross stereotype that doesn't bear out. And I think probably students watching this are very aware. And if they come from privilege, good for them. But I think many of them are going to be aware that they at some point have to become self-sufficient and try and forge their way. And that while, as we're having this conversation in July of 2021, every place in my town has a help wanted sign, but help wanted is not a career. Help wanted is not healthcare. Help wanted is not what you want to do after you finish at LVC.
Right.
And so how do you sort of bridge those two parts of your life? It's, you got to pay some dues and you got to be resourceful.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. So I remember years ago, like when I first started at LVC, they would, especially like in the education department, they say, "Oh, we train people to get jobs and we make sure they get into a job." And I thought that's great. And I probably leaned more on that because I ended up teaching this class. At the same time, I always think, well, once you've got the job, what then? It's not like your life, you've accomplished everything you want to do in your life. You need to have, interests, and there might be things that you're still curious about, and you have kids and you confront, either boredom or, I thought you were going to go to, or people get into a good job and then they get shoved out when they're 53, and then, so they weren't really planning on that. And that's another reality that happens. So all of this is by way of just saying, my view is that you have to be careful, but you also have to try to consider the things and really focus on the education. And then that gives you some resources to draw upon as you're confronting these transitions. So,
and I would offer, in case the opportunity doesn't come up later in our conversation, a few things that I would just throw out, which are like, people might roll their eyes at these, but I wish somebody had said them to me when I was like a junior in college. So I'll just say them. First and foremost, talk to faculty. If you have a good rapport with a faculty member at LVC or, whatever, make an appointment during office hours and just go pick their brain for 20 minutes, right? And sometimes just that little rap session can be so informative and so inspiring. Also, something that I encounter, and we can talk about my own teaching in a few minutes, but, don't be afraid to investigate and sleuth online. I've had students come to me with questions about, oh, will they take my transfer credit at this institution? Or, what schools have the best program for accounting? I don't know, but I know Google does, right? And, I was in college in the early days of sort of, internet sleuthing, but, at this point, you can learn a lot about a graduate program or a university just from tooling around on their website. If you need letters of recommendation, ask way early, maybe months or a semester before you need it. So that way you know that it's going to reflect, quality and care. And that way you stay on good terms with the people who are writing them for you. And then fourthly, something I did kind of by accident, but it was one of the best parts of my undergraduate experience. Anything that was a campus event, a literary event, a guest speaker, a panel discussion, things that were associated with the colloquium, I really went out of my way to attend as many as possible when I didn't have a night class or when, I was caught up on my assignments. And that was revelatory because I got to see, in my brief time at, LVC, we had like military generals come in and talk about like Vietnam history. We had, biologists talking about climate change. We had, authors from other countries. We had local historians talking about the Civil War in Pennsylvania. I just saw so much cool stuff that was sometimes related to my, my interest, but sometimes it just, kind of broadened my sense of the world. And I think doing those things are really practical, easy, free things that we can do to kind of, when we get close to graduating and then ultimately graduate, not feeling adrift.
Right. Yeah. The other, I mean, when you said the thing about letters of recommendation, everybody will need letters of recommendation.
Yeah.
And then you should always ask, what kind of letter can you write me? Because occasionally I have students and you know, ethically, I will say, yeah, I really can't write you a letter because I've got nothing really to say. You were in like one class
Yeah.
and you got a C. So I don't, like if you're asking me, I can't give you much. Or the other is have a conversation with them about that. When I was that age, I didn't want to hear what they would say because I was terrified they would tell me, well, he's got potential, but he's got to learn so much, which is of course true of everyone.
Yeah.
But the other part is that sometimes what ends up happening is somebody had you in a class 2 years ago and you were a great student, and you have to kind of remind them, these are the classes I had with you, these are the papers that I wrote, like anything you can do to kind of refresh their memory, because you have between that experience and that letter, there's probably a few hundred students and maybe half a dozen or a dozen or more classes that they've taught, and so there's just a lot of, and then there's all kinds of stuff going on. So anyway, sorry to.
And the thing is I never. Sometimes we get so anxious. I think we're all creatures of anxiety anymore. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed and anxious. And I think the thing that I would also say that goes right along with that same idea is you don't have to figure it out all at once, but maybe throw a little bit of time at this, here and there, right? And so it doesn't take a lot of effort in your junior year at LVC, for example, to mention maybe needing a letter of recommendation, to a faculty
Right.
member you've had 2 or 3 times, and just say, hey, I'm thinking about graduate school. I'm finishing up my junior year. When I see you in the fall, and when I write letters of recommendation, I try to make sure that I have that student's resume or CV on hand, at least one writing sample. I try to really make it personal and sincere. And that requires time, and giving people enough time to prepare to write one, I think, is crucial. But also, common things, like I often see folks who are 19, 20, they've never had a CV or resume. That's not good.
Right.
They decide that they're going to start looking into graduate school last minute, and it's January, and they don't realize that some programs had early deadlines in mid-December, right before the holidays.
Right.
So just having things on your radar, I think, is just
Right.
so crucial. So you don't have to do all this stuff your first year of college or even your second year of college, but just thinking a little bit about how this works and how things fall. I had a student just this past spring during the pandemic who emailed me and 3 other faculty members. So one email went to 4 people on a Sunday afternoon saying, I need a letter of recommendation tomorrow. I wrote back and said, sorry, but best of luck. But I mean, that to me is the sort of epitome. And it was a well-intentioned person, but they were unfortunately just totally clueless about the etiquette and what goes into this process. You don't want to be that person. You don't want to be that person desperate and panicky, and it's just not a good way to be.
Yeah, the thing that is better is there is more support for the career aspect of what happens after college than when you went there or when I went to college, which is good.
That's good.
And although I think it's still ironically enough, for other reasons, the anxiety levels seem to be objectively quite a bit higher, which is too bad. And in terms of anxiety, I love. When I was in graduate school, I had a boss named Barbara Lazarus. She was an anthropologist, and she was the associate provost, or one of many special associate provosts. And she was a cancer survivor, and she had a young daughter, and she was terrified of getting cancer, and she did in fact die of cancer later, long after I left. But she would get overwhelmed with anxiety, and she was she was just an amazingly wonderful, bright, bubbly person, as well as just really sharp. And she said, well, I don't have time, sort of like Scarlett O'Hara, you know, like, I don't have time to worry about this today. And she would write in her calendar when she was going to worry about having a relapse of cancer. She's like, well, let me look at my calendar. Well, Thursday at 11, I've got 2 hours. And she would write, and she would block out on her time. This is the time that I have to be anxious about cancer. And then she would get there and what's on my calendar? Well, her secretary would say, well, Barb, you could worry about cancer now. And she's like, oh, well, no, I'm going to do something else. But it's a sort of just a silly story, but in some ways it's just a way of saying, if you made a list, if you said, if you read a book or an article, they all more or less say the same things, because it's not rocket science. It's just, you need letters of recommendation, you need a CV. Well, how do you do that? Well, on your list or on your blocked out hour next week, when you're going to do this, you might just say, ask somebody how to put together a CV, or watch a YouTube video on that. And then at least, that is how your anxiety will decrease, because you're actually heading into it, you're addressing it, and it becomes more manageable, because it's not this looming dark cloud. It's just a list of 12 things. And if you knock one of them off every hour once a week, and then by the time you go into your junior year, you're like, oh, like, I at least, not that I still know what I'm doing, but at least I don't have the anxiety, and I've narrowed the list down to like 18 things that I could do, and 23 things that I'm definitely not doing.
On my desk, I have my little, I have a little black book, not for dates, but I forgot that before I said that phrase, it has a different connotation for those of us who are older. But, like, I have several to-do lists, and I have them organized by, teaching things, housework I want to get done this summer, and, things about my creative, projects. And I'm a creature of anxiety, and I think that absolutely, sometimes just throwing 10 minutes at something, right? Well, in some ways, it may not solve the problem, but it might diffuse some of the panic, right? Or it might just give you a plan. And sometimes, it's going to, your friend's story, sometimes planning to plan or planning to worry, as silly as that sounds, but I think one of the big differences, I teach at a community college. The students I see who can stay not profoundly, but just somewhat organized and keep showing up, always make it through. Like, if I just say what separates, not winners from losers, I don't see the world that way, but people who persist and succeed, and people who struggle, it's organization and just showing up. And, you can't do that if you've waited till the last few weeks of your senior year in college, as any student anywhere in the world, and go, oh, geez, I'm walking in 3 weeks. What now? I mean, what now is going to be, I'm going to work in my hometown in retail until I find something else. But, that could have been perhaps prevented by looking into this stuff a little bit earlier. And I think something else we should mention too is I benefited greatly from some killer internships when I was an undergraduate. I interned for both the Smithsonian and the Maryland State Archives. And that's probably the only wise thing I did in my summers as a college student, because I knew that getting experience with, they're known entities, right? Like, I could go anywhere and say, yeah, I was an intern for the Smithsonian. All these years later, it still impresses people. I just did data entry for the Smithsonian, but right? Like, it has a certain cachet. In just a couple months with them, and then I had a good experience with the Maryland State Archives, and they invited me to come back for a second summer. And that right there, right, was, in terms of character building, but also resume building or life planning, awesome stuff. Yeah. So I'm very grateful for that.
No, that's all very good. So you after, when you were in your master's program, you applied for some jobs. You probably applied for PhD programs.
So
And then,
I finished my master's degree at the University of Toledo in 2003, or excuse me, 2005, forgive me. So I graduated from LBC in '03. I finished at the University of Toledo in '05. I always like to tell the story that I skipped my commencement to play a pickup game of football with some friends that Saturday. And then by 7 a.m. Monday morning, I was on a construction site painting houses. That was a really driving to work that day, at 6 something in the morning, knowing that I had just completed a master's degree and I was going back to paint houses. It was a clarion moment because I realized if I didn't at least try, I could blink and the next several years would pass me by. So I applied to several doctoral programs. They all rejected me. I was crestfallen at the time, but in hindsight, it was a great blessing. I don't think it would have been the right path for me. I applied for over 40 jobs in academia. Was fortunate enough to get an interview at Warwick Community College in Salisbury, Maryland, just a few hours away from where I grew up. And I've been teaching there for 17 years. And in that time, I've been very, very fortunate. I got a third degree. My institution largely paid for it. I was able to parlay that into multiple promotions. So I'm a full professor. It's been a great thing. Had I gotten into a doctoral program, I would have been coming out around '08, '09 in the worst financial crisis the country had seen in 2 or 3 generations. And I probably would have been back on a construction site or waiting tables or whatever with a PhD on hand. And so that idea that just because you get a really respected degree, it does not mean that the world is chomping at the bit to give you a good salary and benefits. And so there is a little bit of hustle that one must do. And, one of the things that I said to myself to get through that very anxious summer after I finished my master's was, I sometimes would get frustrated that I'd paint houses all day and then come home and apply for jobs online all night. But I remember thinking to myself, I only need one.
right.
I only need one choice to say, let's give this kid a shot to teach for us or to work at our work for us. And that's what had happened and it worked out. But there's a little bit.
People who get a PhD and then and the odds are so stacked against getting a job. And it was a terrible job market 20 years ago. I mean, I applied for hundreds and hundreds of jobs. I mean, at one point I thought I read somebody said, I took all my rejection letters and then I saved them. And at some point I had a stack this thick and I just thought, and I still didn't have a job. And I thought, this is starting to feel a little too, I don't know what. And then at some point schools stopped sending out rejection letters. You got hired or you got nothing.
You got ghosted, right? It's
right. But the people who didn't get an academic job are often some of the angriest people you will ever meet in life. They are like online trolls, but sort of in person. And so in a lot of ways, it's not that I loved being, I didn't always love being a graduate student, but it's pretty amazing to really dig into stuff, to get your hands dirty, to kind of really get overwhelmed by making sense out of all this information. And that's really cool, but it is really, really, really disingenuous to lead people down that road and then basically shove them off the other side after you've kind of trained them to believe that the only job that is worthy of them would be at the University of Nebraska, but that's only because then you could go to the University of Illinois, and that's only because then you could go to the University of Michigan, and then maybe to Harvard. So if you aren't doing that, you're sort of really nothing.
There was a study done a couple of years ago, and I forget the entity, but basically it said something like 1 to 2% of each year's graduating PhD class is going to get a tenure track job offer at a college or university. and that the likelihood of landing a tenure track job 2 or more years out of graduate school was something like 0.08%. I mean, these are startling statistics. It's not that different than thinking about, what percentage of elite athletes in high school or college make it to the majors. And so
Right.
you could be bitter about that, or you could say, this is just simply what I've inherited. That's
Right.
that's the world. And so how do I find contentment, fulfillment, satisfaction, and say, look, if they don't want me, then nuts to them. I'm going to find something that's going to pay me a decent wage.
Right.
And I'm not big on mantras or sayings, but something I will share is, and this is largely grown out of my writing life as a poet, but something I tell myself a lot is, I don't want to go to the dance with anybody who doesn't want to go to the dance with me. Think about like a middle school or a high school dance. You ask somebody to go to the dance with you. You don't want them to say yes out of pity. That's humiliating. If they don't want to go, it's better to have the no. Thank you. Have fun. Take care. I will find somebody who wants to dance with me. And I think that we all have jobs to pay bills, but then one can't get too jaded, because sometimes people just don't want to dance with you.
Right. Right. No, I think I like that. I like that. It's yeah. Yeah, and yeah, so I always feel like I'm in this funny position because I know that many students, or at least not all, but a good chunk would like the higher education lifestyle, although I think some of that is like influenced by movies like Harry Potter. Like, those professors had offices that look like, they're basically in a castle, which is cool, and then they have magical powers. But often there's a handful of movies that sort of depict what a professor is like, but they're sort of few and far between. I know you like Community.
Yeah, I love that show.
Yeah, for its depiction of community college, but it's yeah. So there's a kind of, yeah, but sorry. So that's,
yeah.
So I hate to say to people, don't do what I did, but if I would have known like how difficult it was, I might have become a carpenter or gone, a lawyer or an HVAC technician. There's many ways to make a living, and you spend a lot. I think the reason people get angry is because they sort of tricked themselves into thinking they were going to beat the odds. They knew the odds, but they've always beaten the odds up until now, and they're really smart. And at some point, Professor Rainbow Unicorn told them that they were special, and they're going to be Professor Rainbow Unicorn.
Yeah.
And somebody does get those jobs, and they're sorry. I was on a grants committee, so at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, so they have like all this 18th century collection, right. And I realized how bad the job market was when I'm reviewing these proposals. They were like amazing. They were looking at this collection of Irish Protestant collections and looking at how like counter-revolutionaries or Irish Catholic revolutionaries were kind of spilling out all over the Atlantic world. And then I read like, this person went to Harvard, and then this person got their PhD from Yale, and then this person's teaching at a college very much like Lebanon Valley College. And I realized, and the writing is just beautifully done. The research is impeccable. And I realized like, holy cow, the job market's bad. Because 20 years ago, that person would have been, they would have been hired at Princeton, or they would have been hired at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And now they're in Middle Tennessee. And
the thing is, it's important cognitive dissonance can be kind of a healthy thing, right? It's healthy to be passionate about something and say, I'm going to go to graduate school and I may end up becoming one of the experts in the world on X or Y or Z, or right. I might end up becoming really, really knowledgeable and talented and capable in this area of research or in this particular expertise. But we also have to, on the other hand, realize that the world sometimes we'll applaud and cherish and appreciate that. But also, like if you think about your most ignorant uncle, right? I mean, he's basically, I mean, like that's the job market, right? Like everybody has at least one uncle who's like obnoxious or inappropriate or crude or just thinks that, and so, think of that as the job market, right? That's your grumpy uncle at the barbecue is the job market. And so, it's how much emotional or spiritual investment do we want to make into stuff like that? And I think the idea of a professorship as a status symbol, or our jobs as status symbols, or our careers as status symbols, one can be fulfilled in a lot of different ways. And, I've been saddened by how many people I've known, many of whom have been friends or acquaintances or colleagues, who have, basically said that they look down upon teaching at the middle school or high school level, or they look down at teaching at a community college, or they wouldn't consider archival work or a government job or going into publishing or, and I just find that to be really disingenuous. I think there's a lot of ways to define, what a career can be. And for people who are history majors or in the humanities watching this, there's a lot of ways to make it in the world,
Yeah. And I think, so as you were talking, I was thinking of this, there's a guy who was like the literature, he was the New York Times reviewer of books, and he was like the literature guy. And at some point his sink backs up. And so he calls a plumber, and the guy who comes and cleans it out is was a novelist. And and basically, a really good one. And he's like, at a certain point, he's just like, oh, here's the sink. And then he's sort of standing there watching the guy work. And then he realizes, oh my God, you're this guy. And he's like, and then he starts trying to engage him. And he's like, do you mind? Hello, I'm working here. I appreciate what you're saying, but and I think there is a lot to be said that a lot of people down through the ages, a lot of great artists have done, other things than kind of what they, Wallace Stevens, for instance, was not a professional poet. He wrote, I don't know a lot about poetry, but when I read his stuff, I'm like, oh my God, he's really it's just so evocative and beautiful. And, I think he was an insurance executive.
Yeah,
he was
he wins the Pulitzer Prize, I think, the year he dies. And, he's working on poems, in between like insurance meetings, the poet Steve Scafidi is one of our great contemporary poets. He's a cabinet maker, I think, in West Virginia or Kentucky, if you accept the proposition that all work has intrinsic value, that all human beings deserve some basic dignity, and you can separate, just because I do something for a living does not mean that A, I can't parlay that into something better down the road. This is where I'm at now. But also B, that my entire self-worth or my entire identity or my time in graduate school is meaningless if I don't land this cush position. I just think it's a real faulty way of viewing things. And, I think there's a lot of beautiful ways to make a life that don't necessarily have to follow some sort of preordained, path. And, I just think that once you have that realization, then you stay open to what might come your way. And if you're honest and hardworking and diligent and just, passionate about what you do and you treat other people decently, opportunities sometimes arise, and then you can jump on them because you've been ready for that moment, Right. So when I was a 20-something guy painting houses, applying for dozens of jobs, I knew, at some point the dam will break and somebody will pick up a phone or email me and I'll get my foot in the door. And then, if I do good in a phone interview, I get a face-to-face interview. If I can be a little bit more charming or a little bit more prepared than the 3 other people interviewed, I might have a job. And that I think is a healthy way of looking at things. And,
Yeah.
You know, I live in a very rural part of Maryland, but I also, you know, the students who complete the nursing program at my community college within a year or two of graduating can make over 70 to $75,000 a year, you know, and that, you know, I have people I know who are in their 40s with PhDs because they are holding on to the dream of I will be a professor someday, and they're living a hand to mouth existence. I'm not judging either one of those types of folks, but it's just, you know,
Yeah.
it's important to consider these things, you know, and
Yeah. 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 No, and the irony is that people who, if you can do a PhD, you know, again, PhDs, it's a lot like what you said about who finishes community college. A lot of it is just they're stubborn, they're persistent. Sometimes that means they have like a spouse who has a job. Sometimes it means they have family money or something else. But oftentimes it just means, you know, they just kind of show up, do their work. So they can do all kinds of things. And I did know people who in graduate school who went on to be, just as you say, they worked in government, they worked in, you know, either as administrators or became, there's even people who became like professional consultants or professional, golly, I'm blanking on the word. They basically are expert testimony in trials. So they would do things like Superfund pollution sites, and they're trying to kind of 25 years or 50 years after something happened, they're still trying to figure out Ford Motor Company, do they have all the liability here? Well, you know, that's a complicated question. You know, how many different companies were there around there that used benzene? And what was the state of the art technology for disposing of benzene in 1954? Well, it was dumping it in the, you know, it was dumping it behind the plant. So, yeah, so Ford, you know, has liability, but they're not the only, you know, so it, and those are, again, those are kind of interesting questions. And then you can, yeah, I don't know. So,
and you know, I'll say this too. Like when I look at some of my closer friends or connections that I made, you know, for both of my experiences in graduate school, my last degree I got at Vermont College. I just want to plug them because it's a great school. But you know, when I look at, you know, friends of mine from both my experience at the University of Toledo and Vermont College, I have a poet friend who inherited his father's exterminating company, and he is the owner and proprietor of a small extermination company out in Ohio. Happily does that family business. Great poet. He has started his own literary magazine on the side. You know, I have another good friend who taught for a little while and then went into corporate copy editing. So he lives in Canada, making a crazy salary doing copy editing. So he's like one of the head, you know, copy editors for this major global corporation. I have another friend who decided she didn't want to teach, so she went back to school after working in the nonprofit sector, and now she's a dean. So you know, teaching wasn't for her, but now she gets to help people who teach and sort of be a liaison in that way. So I mean, there's like so many different ways to make it work if you keep an open mind about it, and you know, are willing to hustle a little. You know, and it doesn't all happen at once too. I mean, we're saying this is, you know, as middle-aged people going, oh yeah, you know, it worked out. But, you know, I remember palpably the anxiety and uncertainty, and sometimes it takes a couple years, but, you know, if you're passionate about graduate school and you can go for free or go for a little bit of nothing, you know, take that leap of faith. If, you know, and, you know, friends and family will help you get through the tough times. But it is startling that just last week, the cover of the New York Times website, NewYorkTimes.com, had a major expose on something that's happening in MBAs, you know, Masters of Business Administration, because there's like a class action lawsuit happening right now where all these people spent over like $300,000 to get a 2 or 3 year master's degree and thought they were promised a quality job upon graduation. And in fact, they're not promised anything. And, you know, now there's questions of was the program vetted and accreditation, and, you know, it's just like, you know,
is this about the temple?
I don't remember.
Because the dean at Temple is like under investigation, and I think he's in trial for basically cooking their stats. He figured out how, like, I think US News ranked schools, and they kind of played around with the algorithm, and then they juked the stats. It was like a couple of bent cops, you know,
Wow.
making their city look safer by just, you know, changing an assault and battery to a, you know,
Yeah, it's a disturbance. Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
disturbance, right?
We can
Murders
put that
become
in a different,
assaults,
we'll,
you
we'll
know.
put that tally marker hash mark in a different category. That, yeah, that wasn't, you know, and look, you know, it's some of it, I think it's important too. You shouldn't go through life, and certainly shouldn't go through your college experience always assuming the worst in people, but it doesn't pass the sniff test. You know, if some part of you goes, this doesn't sound right, then it probably isn't. To spend $250,000 in loans or grants or whatever, and to have a school say, you know, we'll place you at some top you know, firm. I mean, that just sounds too good to be true. That's a lot of money, and, you know, just the expectation that a job will materialize. So I feel for those folks who have been, you know, had their lives turned upside down by that sort of situation. But, you know, we do have to be, it's sort of like going to a doctor. You know, if you have a doctor and you say, Doc, I've been struggling with this for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, and they go, yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, what would we all do? We'd go to a different doctor and go, you know, I went to go see Dr. Smith. They weren't very warm or kind, and they also didn't seem to really help me with my condition. I'm going to go to Dr. Johnson now. And
We'll
boy,
run a bunch of tests and then later
yeah.
say, yeah, I really don't know what's going on. But in the meantime, here's a bill for a few grand.
But yeah, I mean, hopefully that's,
Right. That's my cynicism as a middle-aged guy. But yes.
But I think I guess what I'm saying is that we have to make sure that while we stay optimistic and hopeful, we also just don't get duped, and we don't get suckered by things that are made to sound like guarantees and are clearly not guarantees, you know. And that's not just in academia; it's in anywhere, you know.
Right.
So yeah.
Caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware.
Yeah.
So, Professor Tavel, as always, it's a real pleasure. I will note that I don't know whether students will, you know, students can always email you, and I have your email address.
Yep.
You know, and you know, if they want to kind of get more information, but otherwise, I'm going to leave it there, and then
Sounds good.